My name's Brad Jensen. On behalf of the Georgetown Center for Business and Public Policy, I'd like to welcome you to our event today on NAFTA. Before we turn to the substance of the day, I just wanted to say a word about the center. The Georgetown Center is part of Georgetown University's McDonough School of Business. The center's mission is to bring together researchers from the academic and policy communities, policymakers, and business people to discuss issues at the nexus of business and public policy. The center has an active outreach program. This Georgetown on the Hill event on trade policy is one of the silos within the center. This event is organized by my colleague Bob Bastine, and we host events on trade just about every month up here at the Rayburn Building, but the center also hosts events on other topical areas, including regulation, innovation, and energy. So if you're interested in those and or want to be put on the mailing list, please go to the center's website. Delighted to have a very distinguished panel here today to talk about NAFTA and the prospective renegotiation of NAFTA. I think there are a lot of questions about this prospective renegotiation. What are the objectives? What are the administration's objectives? What are Congress's objectives? What's the private sector's objectives in a potential renegotiation? What's the process going to be? How is this going to work? And last, what is the view from some of our neighbors? How will this play out in some of our trade partners? So I am just delighted to have such a distinguished panel sitting next to me. I will introduce them in the order in which they'll give their remarks. I'm not going to, all of them are very accomplished. You have their bios, but to my immediate right is Jason Kearns, who serves as the Chief International Trade Counsel, Minority Staff for the House Ways and Means Committee. Prior to that position, he served for 3 years in the Office of General Counsel at USTR. To his right is Matt Gold, who is a professor at Fordham University School of Law. Prior to that, Matt served as Deputy Assistant United States Trade Representative for North America. To his right is Ambassador Darci, who served as Chief Agricultural Negotiator within USTR until just recently. Previously, Darci served as Deputy Undersecretary at the United States Department of Agriculture. And at the far end is José Díaz Briseño, who is currently the Washington correspondent for Reforma, the most influential newspaper in Mexico. His reporting with Reforma covers mostly U.S.-Mexico affairs, including trade, immigration, and border security. Previously, Jose was the Washington correspondent for Mundo Fox, a U.S. Spanish TV network. So without further ado, I'll turn it over to Jason. We'll have 5 to 7 minutes from our panelists, and then we'll turn it over to Q&A. Jason? Great,
thanks, Brad. Well, I've seen a number of folks here in the audience who could easily be up here on the panel with us, and so it's a bit of a tough crowd, I would say, but I'll do my best and try to keep things short so we can get to questions as much as possible. I'd just briefly explain the TPA process. The administration has made clear that it's going to follow that process, and it intends to renegotiate NAFTA through that and eventually seek congressional approval. And at this stage of the process, what that means is before finalizing and sending us a letter explaining what the administration's intention is with respect to a NAFTA renegotiation, the administration first consults with the committees of jurisdiction, Ways and Means Committee here in the House side, Senate Finance Committee on the other side, as well as the House Advisory Group on Negotiations and the Senate Advisory Group on Negotiations. Those are the two groups that are set up basically to bring in the chairs and ranking members of all of the relevant committees that have any jurisdiction over any provisions that may be affected by NAFTA. So that could be the Judiciary Committee for IP issues maybe, or Financial Services for those issues, Ways and Means, and obviously for overall, most of the committees are represented on the House Advisory Group. So we have been having discussions with the administration, and I think we're going to continue to do so. After that is finished, the letter explaining what the administration intends to accomplish, its specific negotiating objectives, will be sent to the House and to the Senate. That starts a 90-day process. The idea of the 90-day process is, as I view it, Congress is supposed to consider this negotiation at that time. If we think that this is a wild and crazy idea, we shouldn't be doing this, you could pass a bill saying, whatever you want to say. Maybe it would say this renegotiated agreement would not be subject to fast track if we didn't like the idea, or whatever else. But it's basically 90 days for Congress to kind of consider this and to consult more deeply with the administration before the negotiations kick off. And then after that time, that's when the negotiations can start. So we're really not looking at beginning the negotiations until probably sometime in August at the earliest. One other thing just to explain about TPA real quickly. The TPA has, I think it's like 100 different negotiating objectives. The assumption is that any negotiation covered by TPA would address those negotiating objectives, although some, make more sense for some negotiations than for others. And then the letter is supposed to provide specific objectives. So that could be, as I see it, either more detail on a particular objective or an additional objective, any more guidance as to what it is that the administration intends to get out of the negotiations. So that's TPA. Just real quickly, I'll also just give a couple thoughts on NAFTA. And again, I hope to spend more time just talking with you all, seeing what's on your mind. But I think to me, one thing that's interesting is there's kind of a disconnect right now about what this renegotiation is all about. On the one hand, we hear this is a disaster, NAFTA is a disaster, we'll pull out of it if we can't fix it. On the other hand, a lot of the talk is about we need to improve it and modernize it because it's, whatever it is, 20-some years old. And it seems to me that at some point, there's going to need to be more clarity on whether we are overhauling a disaster or simply trying to modernize it with provisions like data flows and so forth. But it just seems to me like even before we get into specific objectives, we got to kind of decide, what's the overall purpose of the negotiation. Another point I would make on the Democratic side, most of our members voted against NAFTA when it came before Congress in 1992, forgetting now, 3, thank you. And the main issues then, and I think the main issues that will still be very much on our minds now, will be labor and environmental provisions with respect to Mexico. And I can talk more about that later, but that's obviously going to be a focus of our members on the Democratic side. Another thought, there is some talk, and I think this is reflected in the description of what this panel was going to talk about today, about trade deficits, the bilateral trade deficits that we have, and how a renegotiation of NAFTA could fix that. I think from our perspective, that information can be somewhat informative, but mostly not. I think from our perspective, for one thing, global deficits, I think, can tell you a little bit more about what may be going on in trade. But again, there's so many other factors that are at play that we don't tend to fixate on deficits so much as we do on just making sure that we're getting the rules right. But I do think that in the case of our relationship with Canada and Mexico, there are a lot of rules that could be rewritten or written for the first time entirely, and we hope to do that in a negotiation. So some of the examples on that, I think a key issue for us, and we know for the administration, and I'm sure for others, is going to be really focusing on what's going to help American workers the most. And from what we've seen about our current relationship with Mexico, our belief is the most important thing that would help both American workers and also Mexican workers would be to make sure that the Mexicans are actually applying internationally recognized labor rights. And so that's, I think, a key objective for our members, both because of how it would be beneficial on the Mexican side of the border, but also for U.S. workers here. It's, I think, the biggest competitiveness issue we face with Mexico. You know, when you hear about jobs at Carrier going to Mexico, jobs at U.S. auto plants, I think a Mexican worker in manufacturing makes about 1/5 as much as a U.S. worker makes. And that's, in our view, largely because Mexican workers don't have their internationally recognized labor rights. They're not able to to exercise those rights. So that's definitely a key focus. We would also like to see, in this agreement, as with every other, we would like to see strong and enforceable currency disciplines. We haven't had issues so much with Mexico or Canada on currency, but certainly a lot of other countries. And given that this will be, you know, kind of a first new trade agreement, we want to see strong and enforceable disciplines on that as well. Rules of origin is something that's been talked about a lot by the administration, about something that could be fixed and improved. We are open to hearing more about that. I don't think we are yet persuaded that the current rules are necessarily deficient. I think the administration is focused on the automotive rule of origin. The 62.5% rule in NAFTA, first of all, is very complicated and maybe could be simplified or updated, but it's not obvious to us that 62.5% is the wrong number. It's the highest rule of origin of any FTA, so we're going to be hearing more about that, but we don't think it's obvious that is something that needs to be fixed. Other things I would mention, there's the investment chapter of NAFTA. In our view, I think there are a number of cases that suggest, and just the proliferation of cases that suggest that this system needs to be reconsidered, and we need to find ways to strike a better balance, I think, to protecting U.S. investors, but also ensuring that sovereign governments have the right to regulate. Two other issues that we know the administration is focused on that we need to talk about further will be government procurement, where we're getting kind of mixed messages, I think, from the administration. On the one hand, they seem very set on Buy American without exception, but they also want access, I think, to the Mexican and Canadian government procurement markets. And it's hard to see how you can kind of get both of those things to happen. So we'll see where that goes. But there's a lot to discuss there. There's a recent GAO report out that suggests, I don't know yet whether fairly or unfairly, that we aren't really getting the reciprocal access to foreign government procurement markets that we thought we were getting. And so I think that's something that we're going to need to talk about further. And then the final issue I just mentioned is there is talk in the administration about addressing the border tax issue. Mexico and Canada both essentially apply their value-added tax to all products that are sold in their markets, including imported products from the United States. We don't, of course, have a VAT, and so we don't apply similar taxes in the U.S. There's a competitive disadvantage, I think, that results from this, and so this will be something that may be discussed in the NAFTA renegotiations. I think it's not obvious to us that this is the best forum to address that issue. I think Congress, going all the way back to 1974, and every single fast-track bill we've ever passed has identified this as a real issue for the international trading system, but one that would be addressed in the WTO, essentially. And it's not as clear that you'll be able to get Mexico or Canada to agree to a set of rules when the rest of the world isn't also agreeing to a new set of rules there. So that'll be something to discuss as well. I think I'll leave it at that. Thank you.
Thank you, Matt.
First, I want to just talk a little bit about the negotiating dynamic among the United States, Mexico, and Canada, because I think there are some very, very large misconceptions. People imagine that in this kind of negotiation, the United States has much more leverage than Mexico and Canada because we have a much larger market. That is categorically wrong. When you're coming into a free trade agreement, you have leverage that is pursuant to the size of the market you're bringing into the free trade agreement. If you can credibly threaten to withdraw from a free trade agreement, then in a renegotiation, you have leverage that's commensurate with the size of the market that you might be pulling out of the free trade agreement if you don't get what you want. If you, however, cannot credibly threaten to pull out of the free trade agreement, that dynamic does not work. I've talked elsewhere very extensively about how I believe the United States cannot credibly threaten to withdraw from NAFTA. I think President Trump's threats to do so were not just bluffs, but very bad bluffs. I don't think the Mexicans and Canadians took them seriously for a second. I won't get into the reasons why now because we don't have time. But the long and the short of it is that when you're left in a situation where you have three countries, not one of them can withdraw from the agreement, not one of them can credibly threaten to withdraw from the agreement. Each of the three knows that the other two can't do that. You have what is essentially three countries handcuffed together. And this is the dynamic that's been going on for the last 23 years as we've had ongoing talks on almost a daily basis with Mexico and Canada regarding NAFTA. Basically, this creates a situation where everyone has a veto, everyone knows everyone else has a veto, and each country's leverage is exactly the same as the leverage of the other two countries. And have no misconceptions about that. That dynamic has not changed. That's the first thing that I wanted to point out. Second, on the list of negotiating objectives, the draft list that the Trump administration floated by Congress, as we all know, there were a lot of provisions that, a lot of objectives that relate to things that the United States got in the context of TPP. This concept that we have more leverage in a bilateral or trilateral negotiation than we do in a multilateral is completely wrong also. This is really the analysis of someone who looks at negotiation the way a 9-year-old looks at negotiation. The truth is exactly the opposite. The thought process of the Trump administration is we're big, they're little. If we get them alone in a room, we can bully them better. The reality is that the TPP gave us leverage that we had never had before with Canada and Mexico since the day we entered into NAFTA. And we don't, and since President Trump has tossed it out, we don't have that leverage anymore. I'll just use as an example, U.S. dairy wanting better access to the Canadian market. The Canadians have, of course, trade barriers on dairy that you would think violate all sorts of agreements, but they've had them for a very long time, I think since the Middle Bronze Age. And they've been grandfathered into every trade agreement. They're quite legal, but the United States has wanted, we only have a little bit of access to the Canadian dairy market under NAFTA, and we wanted a little bit more. We never made any progress there until TPP, and the reason wasn't because we were offering Canada anything with respect to the U.S. market. Canada already has free trade access to the U.S. market, which again, we cannot credibly threaten to withdraw. So what happened in TPP is that TPP was an opportunity for Canada to get free trade access to Japan's market and to all of the other TPP markets. And not just the ones that were in TPP, but the countries that were lining up to join TPP, huge markets like South Korea, Taiwan, Philippines, Thailand. The reality is TPP was going to have every country that touched the Pacific within a short period of time outside of North Korea, China, and Russia. So the bottom line is that kind of multilateral negotiation, though it's much more complex and much more difficult to pull off. If you do it right, it can give you much more leverage if the United States can position itself as the gatekeeper for Canada to get access to Japan, which is what we did, which was strategically brilliant. And it's now just been tossed away. Now we're back to the same three countries handcuffed. And as a former Deputy Assistant USTR for North America, I can tell you how frustrating that can be sometimes. We will make some progress. We will certainly get some updated provisions in NAFTA, things that NAFTA might have had 23 years ago had it been negotiated now. But we don't have the kind of leverage to get the things that we got in TPP that required leverage. Another point I wanted to make, which Jason alluded to, is the problem of the crazy promises on the campaign trail. Everyone running for president gives lip service to renegotiating NAFTA or trashing NAFTA. That's been that way since NAFTA was first imagined. Responsible leaders give lip service to that, and then they come into office, they face the realities, and they do what they think is right. What we saw in this last election season were political candidates on the left and the right, Bernie Sanders and Donald Trump, just pandering and validating people's beliefs beliefs that people have that are absurd. We all know we lost tens of thousands of manufacturing jobs after we entered into NAFTA, but most of those were lost to automation. And the few that were lost to trade were much more lost to China, trade with China, than trade with Mexico. Our trade deficit, and I agree with Jason, you don't want to put too much on trade deficits, but our trade deficit with China is more than 6 times our trade deficit with Mexico for roughly the same volume of trade. But at the end of the day, we didn't lose those jobs to North American trade, except to a very small degree, and there's nothing you can do to NAFTA that will bring those jobs back. And to make matters worse, Bernie Sanders and Donald Trump campaigned validating people's beliefs that NAFTA is why their dog died. NAFTA is why their spouse left them. And while NAFTA was causing floods, it was simultaneously causing droughts. And when you get into office, and then you have to produce a list of negotiating objectives to change NAFTA, even stepping away from the fact we don't have the leverage to get a lot of those things, even if we got every single change in NAFTA that we wanted to get, guess what? It's not going to bring your dog back, or your spouse, or stop floods, or stop droughts, nor is it going to bring back the tens of thousands of manufacturing jobs we've lost since the first day of 1994. And that's another problem that's more of a political problem than it is a trade negotiation issue, because in trade negotiations, there's nothing you can do about it. But it's something also to keep in mind as the political dynamic moves forward. I don't want to take up too much more time, but just talking about a few of the specific issues, I agree with Jason. We absolutely need much better enforcement provisions. We need enforcement provisions for the labor standards in NAFTA. It would be wonderful to get a currency manipulation section. I don't know what our chances are of getting that, but it would be fantastic to get that. I don't think right now we have immediate problem with currency manipulation, but I think we need to have currency manipulation provisions in free trade agreements. And the sooner we start getting that, the better off we're going to be. I agree with Jason, there's much less room to move in rules of origin than you think. I also agree with Jason that reading what was written in the list of negotiating objectives about procurement was a burst out loud laughing moment. It took me about 15 minutes, and I think I had to flow chart out those 2 sentences to understand what they said. But what they said is, our objective is that Canada and Mexico continue to fulfill all of their government procurement obligations, and the United States does not. That doesn't happen in a trade negotiation. It's not going to happen here. Chapter 11, I think, is a much better provision than people think it is, but it absolutely needs provisions that can clamp down on frivolous cases. Frivolous cases are a very, very big problem. And it's not so much that people take these cases and win, it's that these people bring these cases and they get years worth of media, and the public thinks they're going to win when they're not, and they just don't have the grounds. Our investor chapters and FTAs are written better than people think they are, and they serve U.S. interests far better than people think they do, but we need to clamp down on the frivolous cases. The border adjusted tax is not a NAFTA issue. I've done a very extensive study of it, and good luck with the Congress trying to deliver what they've promised and make it WTO consistent. I just can't see how that can happen. But at the end of the day, it's not really a NAFTA issue. And on that, I think I'll stop for now and hand it over.
Great. So I just need to interject for one moment. I was reminded that Jason Kearns' remarks are not for attribution. I think everybody else is okay being having their comments attributed to them, but Jason's are not. So I apologize for not making that ground rule at the start. But now, Darci, thank you.
Thank you very much. And thanks to all of you for being here. You've heard, I think, a couple of good explanations, one of what the process would be once a renegotiation is kicked off or has begun, that letter of intent is delivered to Congress, and I think a pretty accurate explanation of what the negotiating dynamic is. Our markets are integrated, and there's not really a way to pick out one piece of that without having a big impact on all 3 of us, and we have to keep those relationships in mind. And for all of the rhetoric we have heard about how the United States is losing and NAFTA has been a bad agreement, I just don't think that is true, particularly if you look at the agriculture sector, where NAFTA is critical. That we're talking about our number 1 and our number 2 trading partners, our export markets in agriculture. Sometimes China sneaks in there a little bit, but markets that, for all intents and purposes, have almost become automatic. We don't hear a lot about them because in many ways we take them for granted. We have a rail line that runs from the United States directly into Monterey to feed Mexico's livestock, and we count on a large portion of our feed grains going there. And you don't hear very much about it because they typically go there without a problem. And where we do hear about problems, they're really more irritants. They're not the kind of thing that stops trade in its tracks. They may slow things down. They may create a little more bureaucratic burden. But for the most part, our ag products flow pretty well back and forth. Matt mentioned dairy. That's an area where we've had longstanding concerns, but they aren't necessarily concerns with the NAFTA provisions themselves. They tend to be more regulatory in nature and go back to supply management, where maybe NAFTA isn't our best lever to deal with them. And so if you're thinking about a renegotiation, the words that come to mind, I think, for the ag sector are do no harm and beware of the risk. When we exported last year $46 billion worth of ag products to Canada and Mexico, that's a 342% increase since NAFTA was signed. So again, these have become key and automatic markets. We have in Mexico more than 80% market share of the imports of products in corn, soy, beef, pork, poultry, and well up into the high 90s when you look at beef, corn, and pork, for example. So we are the market of choice for Mexico. And again, that has not been a market that hasn't had some bumps, but really a highly integrated one where our industries work closely together and where the United States is heavily invested in the efficiency and the success of Mexican agriculture as well, and also true of Canada. But we are also looking at re-examining this relationship and sort of questioning how good our partners are to the north and south at the same time that in the southern hemisphere, we are seeing in South America, we're seeing Brazil and Argentina saying, wait a second, where we haven't been globally engaged, we'd like to be more globally engaged. We're more interested in integrating in that global marketplace. And by the way, we produce a lot of the same products that those U.S. exporters do as well. Now, there are impediments to that. There are infrastructure reasons and other things that may make them not as reliable producers or traders with than the United States has been. But we shouldn't think that we are without competition in this space. And when you think about agriculture, even members of the administration, while calling for a renegotiation of NAFTA, have said, well, agriculture, it's okay, or have sent some signals to the ag community that it's not really on the chopping block. Unfortunately, Mexico and Canada could put it there, and I think this negotiating dynamic issue comes forward. And when we've had NAFTA disputes with Mexico and Canada in the past, the first items on that list of possible retaliation for trucking disputes or cool have been ag products. And they know that, one, because we really rely on their markets and it gives them leverage were they to retaliate with them. But they also know that every state has agriculture in it. And so it gives them a great deal of political leverage as well. And I don't think this case would be any different. I think it's very interesting, the comments on rules of origin and whether they could be improved, because we keep hearing that that's a problem area that needs to be changed. Well, changing rules of origin, and we haven't heard a lot of talk about reimposing tariffs, but were we to change rules of origin, that is in effect what we would be doing for manufactured goods, is imposing tariffs on a subset of those goods that don't have them currently. And if I were Canada or Mexico, looking then at what I would put on the table, ag products might be a good bet to say, if you're pulling back access in one area, here are some areas where we might like to see some readjustment too. And so I think you have to consider the fact that just because your idea of a negotiation includes only one sector, that the negotiation itself might not. And when it comes to market access, really the place we have to go with Mexico and Canada is down. And I wanted to say a little bit about the process and that it matters. And you've heard a precursor to this from the previous panelists. But how the negotiation is conducted affects its outcome. And so this next period, that 90 days of consultation, once the administration sends forward that intent to renegotiate, it really matters what those objectives turn out to be after consultation with stakeholders, with Congress, to figure out what is our mandate. Is it to withdraw? Well, we've heard less about that lately, although I heard a little bit more about it in a speech yesterday. Is it to really renegotiate and put all of the issues on the table? Is it to modernize? Do we look at the things in TPP, like bringing in enforceable labor and environment, updating intellectual property, thinking about e-commerce which didn't really exist when we negotiated NAFTA a while ago? Are there ways to make this a stronger agreement that reflects the times? And I think certainly there are, and that some of those items in a mandate could be a win-win if we sorted them out. But the bigger the mandate, the bigger the risk. The more things we put on the table, the more things might come on the table in return. And so you really need to know what you want and exactly how those talks would set up trade-offs before you start, or you will be led in a direction that you don't want to go. And there are many of you in this room who are part of that congressional process that can help to define exactly what that mandate is. And I think in agriculture, again, we have a number of things that irritate us, but a few things that I think would be worth completely opening the agricultural market access provisions of the agreement and putting those at risk to resolve them. There may be other things we can resolve. And the last thing I want to say is that uncertainty in and of itself is costly. And while we talk about what we are going to do to this agreement, we are affecting the decision-making of our customers in the North and the South. Already we saw just after the election a real plummeting in the value of the peso. That is already affecting U.S. ag exports to Mexico. Our goods cost more than they did before this election. And the longer we're uncertain about what happens, the more our customers will need to put in place plans to manage risk. So if they think it is possible, you've seen the bill introduced in Mexico to boycott U.S. corn or to purchase elsewhere. We know that there have been government and private sector conversations with Brazilians and Argentina about purchasing more corn from them. Again, right now, 98% or maybe even 99% of the corn they get comes from the United States. What would that mean? And wouldn't you, if you were in Mexico's position and you thought the corn from the U.S. might cost more if tariffs were reimposed, wouldn't you want to hedge your bets a little bit? So I just did a little back of the envelope calculation. And Mexico bought $2.5 billion worth of corn last year from the United States. Again, a 98% market share of their imports. Let's say that just to be safe and to insulate themselves from risk, they just decided they would purchase 88% instead. That's $250 million of corn that we would not sell to Mexico next year, 73 million bushels, or in the Aurora, Nebraska spot price from a week or so ago, 415,000 acres of corn that would not be going toward the Mexican market. So it does matter, particularly at a time of these low commodity prices for U.S. farmers, that we would be putting that kind of volatility in the mix. And that might all happen just depending on how we define our mandate and about the way that we talk about what it is that we're doing with our partners. And so just, to keep in mind that uncertainty in and of itself creates a difficult situation and volatility for our producers, and that really defining what we're doing and thinking about that end point and being clear about where we want to go will have impacts long before the negotiation itself is complete.
Thank you very much for having me. Thank you for the invitation to Bob, and it's a pleasure to be with all of you here. I'm going to talk to you about a whole different galaxy, which is Mexican politics and its relationship with trade. We have the experts on trade here. I try to be a semi-expert on Mexican politics. It's not news that NAFTA transformed Mexico in a way of becoming an export-oriented powerhouse. Mexico has now 10 FTAs with 45 countries in the world, 35% of GDP value. That's what exports are in Mexico. And more importantly, NAFTA cemented a whole different bilateral relationship with the U.S. After 9/11, it grew even tighter, and after 2008, when the drug war was at its height, also security cooperation reinforced the relationship. We don't have comparable data, but positive views of NAFTA in Mexico since 2004 have averaged around 60%. But one thing that is overlooked when people talk about renegotiation of NAFTA and how it's different to the early 90s when originally it was negotiated is that Mexico is today a full-blown democracy. Back in the 90s, it was a one-party hegemonic rule. And the PRI had majorities in both houses and majorities in the governorships. Today is whole different. And today, public opinion it matters in Mexico. And I'm going to throw some numbers that are relevant for the discussion here. The most recent Reforma poll about President Peña Nieto's approval was in January, and it had the president's approval in 12%. So the U.S. is facing a very unpopular administration. It's not necessarily due to NAFTA, but it has to do with the way the economy is moving, crime, and obviously corruption, some human rights scandals too. So there's not much room for maneuver. President Peña Nieto is in his 5th year in office, and also in January by inauguration, Reforma conducted a poll, and it came out that 75% of the public in Mexico thought that Mr. Peña Nieto was not ready to deal with Mr. Trump. Obviously, this followed an 18-month long period of Mexico bashing and Mexico becoming a piñata in all sorts of issues during the campaign. But obviously, the milestone and the highest moment of tension became this moment when then candidate Trump visited Mexico in August of last year. 85% of Mexicans thought that that was a mistake. 86% of Mexicans have a negative view of President Trump, compared to 81% of positive views of President Obama. But Mexicans in general and middle-class Mexicans are very engaged with U.S. issues. 28% of Mexicans watch or listen, President Trump's inauguration speech. So the issue of U.S.-Mexico relationship is at the top of our minds. And just to be sure, only 16% of Mexicans polled in January thought that the first action of President Trump would be renegotiating NAFTA. At the top of the list were more deportations, the construction of the wall, and stopping investments towards Mexico. But anyway, just a brief summary of how the Mexican government approached to this possible renegotiation. I think, just like many observers, the Mexican government was caught unaware of the real power of the anti-trade sentiment in some areas of the country. For most of the primaries, the Mexican government resisted to any idea that NAFTA could be renegotiated. It was not until September that Mexican officials changed their tune and thought, we can modernize NAFTA in the way of the TPP, the TPP guidelines, and it was not until Trump won in November 2016 that Mexico really started taking the possibility of renegotiations seriously, and that derived on a change at the foreign ministry. An expert on economy, Mr. Luis Videgaray, is now heading that ministry, and it's definitely the guy. Despite Mr. Guajardo heading the negotiations formally, Mr. Luis Videgaray at Foreign Ministry is certainly the most trusted advisor of President Peña, and who's defining the strategic vision of the relationship. Now, on January 23 of this year, President Peña presented a whole set of principles on how to deal with negotiations with the U.S. Two of those 10 points were related to trade. One was specifically defending free trade in North America, and the second, trying to expand NAFTA towards new sectors like e-commerce, as was mentioned here. And the key point here was that Mexico was ready to put everything on the table to increase leverage when dealing with the U.S. And they were talking about curtailing security cooperation, migration management, dealing with Central America. And so the Mexican government really took seriously about what was happening. Obviously, All of this went south for a brief time when President Trump basically trashed a meeting with President Peña on January 26. I remember this mini war between President Peña and President Trump that ended with this tweet. And to be sure, Foreign Minister Videgaray has been in trade discussions at senior levels in the White House, obviously between the so-called nationalist and the more internationalist wing. Mr. Kushner, Mr. Cohn, Mr. Bannon, Mr. Navarro have been part of these conversations, but it was not until Secretary Ross was confirmed early in March that Mexico really engaged in much more formal negotiations with the U.S. administration on trade. And it was not until after a dinner between Mr. Guajardo and Mr. Videgaray that really Mr. Ross started to adopt some of the talking points that the Mexicans have been presented for the past 3 months regarding, presenting new sectors to be incorporated into NAFTA, like e-commerce and all these issues that we know about. Anyway, for the most part, most Mexican commentators are encouraged for what they saw on this draft of the 90-day notification that was circulated almost 3 weeks ago, I think. But there are still doubts about who will win within the U.S. administration and the camps between the internationalists and the nationalists. And just to finalize, I'm going to talk about what are the restrictions that the Mexican government has going forward, considering that 2018, it's an election year in Mexico. It's now very public that the Mexican government wants to finalize any kind of negotiation of NAFTA by the end of 2017. And it seems that the U.S. administration is very aware of it. Secretary Ross has come out publicly about this and saying that this would be helpful anyway. For Mr. Peña Nieto, a successful set of NAFTA talks are crucial both economically and politically. The current ruling party in Mexico, the PRI, is at the bottom of preferences going forward in the election year. It only has 17 of the preferences, and the leading party in the pack is Morena, which already has a virtual presidential candidate who is Mr. Andrés Manuel López Obrador, whose career has built a little bit on being a skeptic on trade. Now, Mr. López Obrador was here almost a month ago, and it was interesting to listen to him because even in the left corners of Mexican politics, opposition to NAFTA is not as vigorous as it was back in the early 90s when NAFTA was negotiated. But still, there are many doubts. When he was posed the question about what he would do about NAFTA, the direct quote by Mr. López Obrador was the following: "The U.S.-Mexico trade relationship is extremely interconnected, particularly at the top. But this doesn't mean that NAFTA is a panacea for Mexico. It's a trade relationship among elitists." Well, so there's a possibility that the next president of Mexico could be someone who really doesn't believe on the way trade has been managed. And anyway, for the politically it's relevant to have good NAFTA talks to present a credible candidate towards the election, and economically also to avoid any kind of alteration. We have seen these past few months the comeback of the peso after it bottomed down during the election. But, and just to finalize, there's a wild card happening here. Foreign Minister Videgaray has not discarded its intentions to be a presidential candidate in the next year, and some observers in Mexico think that he could be the candidate. In order to participate in the election, he would have to quit his post by December the 3rd of this year. So that in itself puts you a deadline of when he would like the NAFTA talks to finish and to be successful. This opens many questions, but I'm happy to respond.
Thank you. Thank you all. So we'll open it for for questions, when you ask your question, if you please identify, give your name and your organization, and then ask your question.
And use the microphone.
Okay, we have a microphone coming. I think this was the first hand over here.
Yes, my name is Kami Bhatt. I'm with the Pakistani Spectator. And my question is about do you think that President Trump would be able to repackage NAFTA or other international trade agreement in the absence of Steve Bannon? As you know, Dr. Peter Navarro and Dr. Ross, they are the most forceful people, but their real power was coming from Steve Bannon, who has lost his influence. Now you have Gary Cohn, international traders. So how Mr. Trump can satisfy his, labor side or blue collar American worker by repackaging these NAFTA international trade in the favor of laborers? Thanks.
All right, I'll take a shot at it. It's an interesting question. It's a question about communications. And, I've said many times that while I think the TPP was the greatest accomplishment in negotiation in the history of American trade, I also think it was the single greatest failure in communications in the history of American policy. I don't think in the history of this country we have ever had anything that was as good for America, that was as reviled by Americans. And the question really goes to communications. Communications in trade is really hard because it's very technical and it's very complicated and it's very hard to fit it into a soundbite or a tweet. And I don't think Peter Navarro's lost his influence internally. I don't think Wilbur Ross has lost his influence internally. I think these guys still have their mojo. And I think that the president, if he's anything, he's a communicator. And if they want to communicate the reasons why good trade policy is good, they need to focus on communications and do that. And if they really focused on it, they could. It's a matter of getting the message out there, whatever message they want.
I can add a little bit. To me, what will be most interesting too is to see Bob Lighthizer, if he is confirmed, to see him become USTR, because from my perspective, I think U.S. trade policy does need some pretty significant changes, but we need to not throw out the baby with the bathwater. And I think Bob Lighthizer is somebody who knows the areas where it needs to be fixed, I think, and knows the need for us to have, I think, a more assertive approach to trade than we've had for many years. But also again, sort of is smart enough to know how to do this right. And so I think that'll be the most interesting change, I think, coming up, rather than kind of all these intriguing stories you hear about what's going on within the White House.
Hi, I'm Ed Gerwin from the Progressive Policy Institute. Jason, you had mentioned that the administration is following the TPA process, but then again yesterday, President Trump bashed the TPA quite forcefully, including expressing frustration about how handcuffed he felt by all the notification and consultation processes under the TPA. I have two questions on that. Number one, could you and the panel tell us a little bit about what a trade negotiation would be like if a tweet were to come down to say that we are not going to follow TPA? And number two, do you think this administration will take the notification and consultation obligations under TPA seriously?
If they weren't to follow TPA, look, TPA gives you, at the end of the day, an up or down vote. So it's if they want to forego that, I don't think that would be my advice to them. I think that they are going to have to follow that process. The answer can be a lot lengthier than that, but I think leave it at that. And then the other question was sort of whether I think they are following the.
Well, whether the degree to which you think they'll take the consultative process seriously. No matter what people said about the Obama administration, I think folks up here felt that they were up here all the time talking to people. whether
Yeah.
people agreed with them or not.
Right, right. So a couple things. I think early on, I think we've seen some reason for optimism. I think the administration has come up here and talked to us, at least at the committees of jurisdiction, quite a bit. And to me, too, by the way, I have to mention, I think it's easy to get bogged down into kind of the legal technicalities of TPA about whether or not they had this meeting and how many times. I have to say also with the last administration, how many times they came up. I mean, we're more concerned about how meaningful the consultations are. Are you actually listening to what we're saying and having that, be reflected in the positions you're taking? And so that's what we're really going to be looking for with this administration. I think early on there was some reason to be pretty optimistic, as I said. We've had a number of meetings with Secretary Ross, and that's encouraging. But I'm also a bit concerned. I mean, there was some talk at the end of last month that this notification letter, the draft of it had been shared only with the Republicans and not with us. And I think, to me, it's very clear that this won't work well unless, we're really part of the process. So it remains to be seen. But, I think, as I mentioned, I think a lot of the people who will be working on this, seem willing to engage. So hopefully things will work out okay that way.
Anyone else want to weigh in?
Just keep in mind that the requirements of the executive branch under TPA are law. I mean, they don't really have a choice. And despite the bluster, Donald Trump has been pretty careful to follow law when it's been clear. I imagine Jared Kushner in the Oval Office every day saying, "Dad, whatever you do, don't break laws. They can only impeach you if you break laws." So they've been pretty tight on clear mandates. Also, USTR is the one who goes, and I did this for TPP, goes over to Capitol Hill and sits down with congressional staffers and answers questions. And the professionals at USTR are almost entirely career professionals, and they're used to doing this. And I think it's likely they'll follow the TPA requirements in good faith.
Thank you. Adam B. Sudi with Politico. Do you all think that we're past the point of no return in terms of if the president gets frustrated by this process, he wants to go back and just do this as an executive type tweaking of the agreement? Have promises been made to the point that they really can't go back and kind of cut Congress out of this process at this point?
I'll bite. I mean, I think the short answer is yes. I think it's going to be very hard for this to not be something that has to go through Congress. Another way of answering, not so much whether or not promises have been made, but what I would just say is, and it's really easy to get into a lot of detail about, what kind of renegotiation would require congressional approval or not. But the bottom line really is, if you're talking about a really meaningful, significant renegotiation of NAFTA, that requires congressional approval. If you're talking about a few little things here and there, it doesn't. So, which could then be an executive agreement. The problem is, I just don't think that's what got this president elected. In other words, if NAFTA is this disaster, having some sort of side agreement on data flows, that's probably not going to satisfy voters in Ohio. So I just don't see how you quite square those things.
Anyone else? No? Okay. Stan?
My name is Stanley Nolan. I'm at Georgetown University Business School. You folks mentioned labor standards as one topic for discussion, and it's been controversial from the beginning in NAFTA. Can you tell us what exactly is wrong with labor standards, according to those who want to fix them, and how do those NAFTA labor standards differ from international labor standards you mentioned, and also U.S. regulations?
I feel like I'm monopolizing the time here, but I guess I'm the one that raised the labor standards. Darci probably with ag doesn't have to talk about that as much. But Right. So the problem, there's a number of problems with labor standards in Mexico where they do not meet ILO, fundamental rights. The two biggest issues are they have these things called, and Jose may be able to fill in on this too, these arbitration boards, which I think of as kind of like the NLRB in the U.S. The problem is the way these are structured is such that it's a fairly corrupt system where, independent unions and workers that want to form unions don't have any real ability to get through there. In essence, it's because you've got these boards are formulated by someone from management, someone from the government, and someone from the unions. The someone from the unions is someone from the incumbent unions who are pretty closely tied to the PRI, and it's a pretty incumbent-focused system that doesn't really allow for the free exercise of worker rights. So that's one issue that needs to be fixed and is inconsistent in our view with the ILO, freedom of association, and right to collectively bargain. Another issue is they have these things called protection contracts, protection meaning protection for the workers, not for the employees, where sometimes you'll have one of these agreements formed, contracts formed, even before a single worker has been employed in a factory. And the protection contracts will essentially just repeat what's required under minimum wages and that sort of thing. So those are the two things that we really want to see fixed. There's a number of other issues as well, but those are the things that require the most attention. The good news, I think, and there is quite a bit of good news here, we have, going back to the May 10th agreement from 2007, U.S. free trade agreements have included labor standards in the text of trade agreements. TPA reflects that fact, so that's positive. Mexico, through TPP, agreed to those labor changes in the chapter. But again, where the rubber is going to meet the road is Mexico actually going to implement these changes? A little bit more good news on that. They actually have taken some steps so far that may bring them into line with these international labor standards, but they're not there yet. And so we're going to have to see this process through to the end.
And just take an analytical step backwards. The problem with NAFTA is that when George H.W. Bush negotiated the agreement, initially it didn't have any labor or environmental standards. When Bill Clinton came in and on his coattails, more Democrats in both houses of Congress, he went back and negotiated side agreements for labor and environment, which were signed but not part of the main treaty. And as a result, they're not enforceable. The enforcement provisions in the main NAFTA don't apply to the labor and the environmental standards, which then leads to everything Jason just talked about. It's partially Mexico not even meeting the standards in the side agreement. It's not even about renegotiating the standards. It's about enforcing the standards that are already there. The other observation I wanted to mention is that Mexico is still part of TPP, even though we're not. And it looks like that's going forward without us. So the Mexicans may have to bring themselves up to those standards under TPP anyway, where the environmental rules are stronger but also enforceable.
Just a quick mention. Basically, it was reported in a Politico story that Mexico had agreed to reform these arbitration panels for labor disputes in Mexico under the TPP negotiations, right? Mexico actually passed a reform of these, and the Mexican president is holding the last piece of the enactment of the reform. He hasn't signed the law itself. The majority of Congresses from the states have already passed the law, and they have voted, and Mexico has been holding the final signature since February. I don't know why, but probably is to keep a card to play in the coming talks. And unfortunately, despite all these reforms, these go back to Mexico's Achilles heel, which is an effective rule of law. And this basically is an area that the administration has to engage in another way through the State Department and others, and there's still not much cooperation happening at this time.
Alex Goldberg, Governor Cuomo's office. You mentioned that the TPP gave us leverage like we'd never seen before, and you gave the example of the dairy industry in Canada. So now that TPP is gone, what exactly leverage does that give us, if any?
As I said, it puts us back to where we were before TPP, which is the 3 countries moving along. Every year, at least until now, just about every year, we've had a summit among the 3 leaders, a North American Leader Summit. Every year, at least until now, we've had a ministerial trade ministerial, which means the trade ministers, our USTR, his counterparts in the other 2 countries meeting every year in the form of the North American Free Trade Commission. And most of the year, there are ongoing talks among the staff level people, the assistant USTRs, the deputy assistant USTR for North America, our Canada director, our Mexico director, are in ongoing discussions with their Mexican and Canadian counterparts, usually all 3 countries at the same time, conference calls, emails, meetings about all the issues that exist among the 3 countries that lead up to the ministerial meeting and lead up to the Leader Summit. And that's been going on constantly for 23 years, but we've made little progress in changing things because of the dynamic I explained earlier. I think there's definitely more inertia now to make more progress, and there will be more progress. But again, a lot of the things on that list are not going to be achieved. The ones that are going to be achieved are things like e-commerce, which are in the mutual interest of all 3. And even if everything were achieved, again, it's not going to bring back jobs that weren't lost because of NAFTA in the first place. So expectations need to be ratcheted down a bit.
If I might, on dairy itself, because it's getting so much attention and because the relationship on dairy is rather complicated, I think we need to break out what are sort of the market access provisions of NAFTA versus regulatory changes and some of the rules of supply management. So in the Canada-U.S. trade agreement and in NAFTA that followed, we did not get access to the Canadian market for dairy, poultry, and eggs, the 3 products that Canada controls through supply management, maintains very high tariffs and border control, and doles out very specific licenses for how much Canadians can produce and at what price they can sell it in order to keep prices high for their farmers. Again, NAFTA didn't touch that. They maintained that and didn't really put those products on the table. But the dairy industry has sort of evolved despite NAFTA, given that it's 23 years old. And so new dairy products were developed based on technology and things like ultra-filtered milk, milk protein concentrates that were not anticipated in the tariff schedule when we did NAFTA, and that the U.S. can now export duty-free to Canada. What Canada has done then, looking at the fact that ingredients can now pass from the U.S. to Canada duty-free, is to use supply management to create incentives for Canadians to purchase, Canadian processors to purchase Canadian milk instead of buying those ingredients from the U.S. And so you're seeing a rule change to their internal structure, the creation of a new class of milk that makes milk used for ingredients into cheese, for example, in Canada, cheaper, so that it's easier to buy the milk in Canada than to import those products. And that's putting real pressure on dairy farmers, particularly, as you know, in New York and Wisconsin. But that's not the market access provisions of NAFTA. And the real legal questions about then what happens to those products that are processed, and are they being exported, and are the incentives created by these new policies in fact legal, given their obligations under not just NAFTA, but under the WTO, about how you control, use subsidies and pricing and entering your products in international commerce. Those are really the areas of analysis and leverage we have to look at. But the market access for NAFTA itself didn't include those products. If we wanted it to include those products and we were going to ask Canada for more under NAFTA, presumably they would say, what more are you going to give us? And so that's where in a negotiating dynamic, it's not clear, just like on government procurement, we want more, but we'd like you to take less, is a hard mandate to bring home. So there's lots of sort of dynamics at play, and we have to think about the best place to get recourse for what's stopping our products from moving right now.
Very much. I'm Bob Vastine. I'm a senior fellow at Georgetown at the center. And this is all really fascinating, and especially from the standpoint that our demands are so excessive. I mean, extensive and maybe excessive. We have this draft letter that we all probably read, which lays out a lot of the administration's objective, primarily, firstly, reducing the goods deficit. Well, how are we going to do that? So my question to you is, What's in this for Mexico and Canada? What do they want? Do they want enough to justify their giving us at least some of what we want? I mean, how can this negotiation go forward when two of the partners maybe don't care a lot? Maybe about some stuff, but yes. Is Mexico willing to change its some fundamental elements of its polity in order to satisfy our NAFTA renegotiation demands? It just seems improbable.
I would just talk very briefly. Many Mexicans and many analysts are already saying that keeping the status quo would be the best interest for Mexico at this time, going after 2018, considering the battles within the administration and Mexican politics in itself. People are thinking, well, we need strategic patience to continue this process as long as it could. Some people think that's in the best interest for Mexico.
Business people in MBA programs, they use this metaphor about using judo instead of karate. The idea being that when someone's coming charging at you, rather than meeting his force with your force, you step out of the way and you let his inertia work against him as he goes past you and falls flat in his face. The Mexicans and Canadians are playing a long game. They're playing a very smart game. I think they're using judo instead of karate, and I think they're, to some degree, they're letting Donald Trump charge forward into a deep mud. And we're now getting into a long, slow negotiation over a few things. I think some things will come out of this, but I think it'll take a lot longer and less will come out of it than people expect, certainly far less than it's on this list. In terms of what's in it for Canada, you got to look at each individual issue, but there aren't many of these issues on the list of the draft that was sent by the administration to Congress that the Mexicans and Canadians have a lot of strong interest in working with.
I would just say that for all of the issues that we want and what we're thinking about and talking about our legislative process, they also have legislative processes. And so Mexico and Canada have to run the same process as well. And, when you're at the negotiating table with your counterparts, part of what you have to think about is, one, where can you split the baby? What is the result? But then how are you each going to tell that story? And so if we want all of these things for the U.S. and we can come back and say why it's beneficial and our Congress is going to vote on it and say, yes, it is, what is the story they are going to tell about why it was appropriate for them to make those trade-offs? And if you're a negotiator, you already have in mind somehow how your counterpart is going to be able to say, this is a win for us, and this is the way the trade-offs were set up. Again, how you structure the negotiation matters for your outcome. And that's the piece that, again, exactly what we ask for and how we structure it as a trade-off and in both substance and timing is the piece that I haven't yet seen, and where that 90 days of sort of what are our objectives and consulting with Congress and with stakeholders about how we actually think we can achieve them, that's why that timing is so critical, because they're going to have to ask their own legislators to vote and say, here's why this is a good deal.
Jump into real quick. I mean, I agree. It's a great question. I don't have a great answer, and I agree with all the other comments that were made. I would make 2 points, though. One is, I think it is important to not just to assume that that something that the U.S. wants is something that Mexico wouldn't want, right? So, because we see this in these negotiations all the time, and there's just this assumption made that, it's always going to be this quid pro quo. But whether it's, ISDS reforms, maybe rules of origin, I think the Mexicans actually might be more interested on autos changing the rules of origin than a lot of folks in the U.S. are. I'm also kind of think that the Mexicans would benefit more from it than we would. I think if we have more rule of origin, more content in the North American area, vis-a-vis China, for example, that's probably going to be more in Mexico than it is in the U.S., but who knows? But then the last point I want to make, Jose referred to, I think, what President Peña Nieto said in a speech about what they want to get out of this negotiation. This isn't a trade negotiation from their standpoint, right? This is the U.S.-Mexico relationship, right? So, it'll be immigration. It could be all these other things that we think, well, that's just not relevant, to a trade negotiation. But, they may raise those. One interesting thing of what President Peña Nieto said, at least for a trade wonk, I think this is fascinating. They want to protect U.S. investors in Mexico from being discriminated against by the United States, you know, carrier, whoever it may be, right? This is exactly the opposite of what our investment chapters look like. We assume that the United States is going to have to protect U.S. investors in Mexico. But President Peña Nieto said, wait a minute, I need to protect U.S. investors in Mexico from the United States. So it turns the investment chapter on its head, and I don't know how we're going to negotiate that. That'll be interesting.
Just one last thing I just wanted to add, I'm sorry, is that occasionally a country, because of its internal dynamic, actually wants to change something, and a trade agreement is a nail they can hang their hat on. You know, there are internal pressures in Canada for them to strengthen their intellectual property laws. I don't know if they're at a tipping point yet, but if they got to one, if they were also in a NAFTA negotiation at exactly the same moment, they could use that as a political mechanism to hang their hat on, working on strengthening their intellectual property laws. It's just an example of the kind of thing that happens.
Follow up very quickly, Brad. Okay, if let's say we're going into the mud pit. It's all a swamp. Nothing happens. Negotiations drag on for years. In trade negotiations, what's happened? 15 years to get China into the WTO. Many more than that to get Russia. So these things take time. Are we in a position where President Trump and his advisors might take unilateral action that is contrary to the agreement and to law?
As I said before, I don't think they'll take action contrary to law. I don't think they'll cross that line for their own reasons. Okay. I don't know what else you might want to say on that subject.
Thanks very much. Great discussion. Ted Olin from the Council on Foreign Relations. I want to ask the question from a different direction. So if you accept the legitimacy of the concerns that had some big role in Donald Trump becoming president, particularly people with modest education, who have lost access to decent work opportunities, whether it be in manufacturing or in other sectors. If you're going to try to solve that problem, how do we create new, better working opportunities for those people? What would you do, and where, if at all, would trade negotiation or renegotiation fit into trying to solve that problem?
Well, I mean, first of all, in some ways, I would divorce the issue from trade negotiation. I think that we need a more holistic look at how we prepare our workforce for a changing economy. And the fact that we have a program that I think is not responsive enough, not large enough, or inclusive enough in terms of the sectors that it covers to get there, that and it's not really a public-private partnership. So we haven't necessarily gotten buy-in from the industries who need these workers to continually be retrained. And so I think there are examples out there, Switzerland, some other countries who have more of an apprenticeship, a retraining model that you can get new workforce skills at different points in your career without stigma to try and evolve with the changing needs of the economy. And we just do not have a comprehensive look at keeping our workforce ready and prepared to engage in a globalized economy. And I think in some ways marrying the programs we have with the idea that we are making up for those who lose from trade has made it harder on the trade side, but also made it harder to look at it as a, not a recovering from damage, but rather just being prepared to be offensive in a changing world look at our workforce. And so a whole new vocabulary and a much more concerted effort around it, I think, is needed.
Yeah, and I think that connects to trade adjustment assistance, which could be much better funded and could do a lot more, do many of the things that Darcy's talking about. Some of the same people who've been railing against trade agreements also oppose trade adjustment assistance because they see it as an entitlement. But at the end of the day, it's one of the most direct ways to help people retrain, help them relocate, help them shift sectors as our economy is shifting. The other thing is focus on the things we do well. I mean, we dominate the world in insurance services, in financial services, in business consulting services, in legal services. We dominate the world in music, in television, in movies. And going out there and negotiating new agreements that move services forward like TISA, and that clamp down intellectual property rights for our movies and our television and our music, going out and further strengthening those regimes internationally is something else we do that's important. And at the end of the day, when you have an administration that comes in that wholesale just wants to trash all trade agreements, even the ones that move those things forward where we export so well, you know, use any metaphor you want, you know, shooting yourself in the kneecap, throwing out the baby with the bathwater, so on and so forth. So there's both those things. There's much more we could do in the area of what Darci was talking about, and then there's also the things through trade negotiations agreements we can do to help the exports in the areas where we compete better.
So I'll have used the moderator's privilege and pile on and say, you know, well, I think Matt's point about services is absolutely right. I think we've lost sight of what made America's standard of living the envy of the world. And that's always been that we've been ahead of the curve in terms of education. We're ahead of the curve in terms of primary education. We're ahead of the curve, ahead of the rest of the world in terms of compulsory high school education. We were ahead of the world through the GI Bill in terms of college education. And the rest of the world got the message and has caught up. And we need a new trick. We need to figure out how we're going to continue to be a global leader in terms of education. I think that's the way we bring people forward. And that it's not part of this dialogue, to me, is a huge gap.
Let me just take from there, because I absolutely agree. I mean, I do think TAA needs to be strengthened, but it goes beyond that, and certainly to just strengthening our entire education system. It's really about investing in ourselves, I think, and that means both education, training, also infrastructure. You know, I mean, I think that's a big part of it. But I also would say, to me, it isn't just about non-trade issues. It is also about what's in our trade agreements. And to be frank, I think we often prioritize issues in our trade agreements that don't really matter to average American workers. And we should put more of a priority there. You know, one thing I would get, and this is the best example to me because I don't think there are many economists who would disagree with this. Because some will say, well, you know, if you strengthen this sector or that sector, you know, it ends up just reshuffling the deck. But, you know, if you just look at currency manipulation, and I hate to harp on that, and it doesn't involve Mexico or Canada as long as I can remember. But there is, I don't think, any real question that millions and millions of jobs have been lost in that. And it is in those places, and it is the type of workers we're talking about who are very unhappy with the status quo in trade. And they have every right to be unhappy about the status quo in trade. And the services provisions, as important as they are, and the IP provisions aren't going to give them much. But, you know, actually addressing that issue would. And we haven't. We haven't even mustered up enough will to do anything about it. And so I think that's a good example. But to me, again, you know, also labor standards in these other countries. If we can bring up labor standards in places like Mexico or Vietnam or Bangladesh, some of that's a competitiveness issue. It's not all a competitiveness issue. You know, Bangladesh jobs are probably not going to come back here. But in the case of Mexico, I can tell you for sure it makes a difference, right? If you're talking about a Mexican auto worker making a fifth what they make here, you think that doesn't have an impact on jobs decisions? It does. And I'm not saying they're going to, you know, have the same wage at the end of the day. They're not, because their unions there will realize, well, we need to have a competitive advantage. There will be a competition between Mexican and American workers. But that disparity just doesn't make any sense.
So I think one more question. Oh, yeah.
Got the mic. And Dave Solmonson with American Farm Bureau, question for Ambassador Vetter. The panel's talked a lot about the difference in negotiating dynamic between a multilateral or a TPP versus a NAFTA. And so, Darci, I'd like you to, maybe if you can, help us with, from the ag side, and we're thinking about, of course, what can be included in the NAFTA renegotiation, modernization. What can we usefully bring forward from what was achieved in TPP from that environment into the environment of just discussing with Canada and Mexico? I mean, we had gains both in market access, rules changes. How much of that is applicable and how much isn't?
Well, I think you're absolutely right that the multilateral or the regional structure of TPP allowed us to have a discussion about its normative value, that you'd have a region playing by similar rules and making then trade and the supply chain value of products moving in and out of that region more predictable. What we're supposed to do in a trade agreement is reduce the cost and risk of doing business, and you do that best if you know what conditions you're going to face with partners when your product hits the border. And in agriculture, the biggest wild card is often in SPS barriers, or sanitary and phytosanitary measures, not knowing what human health and animal and plant health measures a country will put in place. In TPP, we were able to get all of those countries to agree to WTO plus provisions in SPS, something we had not done in previous agreements even that the U.S. had negotiated with other countries, and really put a focus on transparency about those provisions, the use of notice and comment, which we take for granted here, that if, APHIS puts out a new rule, you can ask them, put in your comments and say, do you really have to do it that way? Can you achieve the same result by using another method? Did you think about what the cost would be for small business on this method? Could you, skin the cat some other way? And they have to take that into account. That does not happen in a lot of our partner countries, or certainly not in the same way. That was a key obligation. Transparency and clarity of testing procedures, fast notification if there was a problem at the border, and then just a much stronger emphasis on making sure that science is not just the basis for putting in place a measure, but that science was clearly informing the measure itself and whether it was the least trade restrictive necessary measure to get rid of the risk. So again, the idea was that by having a number of countries who were all trying to do business with each other, the value of taking on those other obligations was suddenly increased several-fold. In a bilateral negotiation, getting someone to change their whole SPS regime might be asking a bit much. I think, however, in the NAFTA context, because of the strength of our alliance, and because with Canada, for example, we are also exporters of the same products to third countries that are hitting some of the same barriers in those third countries, if we can show a good working model amongst ourselves, that might be an area of a win-win. We've invested a lot in Mexico's industries, where they're becoming exporters of pork, for example, as well. And that, they could see benefits from third markets of us using that more robust model. But again, the question, I think, is what would we pay for it? Because the other key thing you get on SPS in a free trade agreement is that you create these institutions. Matt mentioned the meeting of trade ministers. Well, there's also usually a meeting of the regulators every year among FTA partners. And what we have with Mexico and Canada that we don't have with some other countries is a really deep Rolodex of animal and plant health officials who all know each other because of the volume of trade and the issues they have to resolve on a daily basis. And the more that other countries understand our system and our processes that we use to combat problems, the easier it is to resolve them, because we can demonstrate why, we've made a situation right, whether it's avian influenza or BSE or what it might be. And so, again, I think that's an area where there may be some low-hanging fruit. I think the question is it seen as a win-win, or is it something where we might have to pay something for it, and then we have a strategic decision to make?
This has been fascinating, and I'd like to continue all afternoon. However, I'm sensitive to that we're going to lose the room. So please join me in thanking this distinguished panel.